let's come back to the example you saw earlier in the course about this list of contacts. I mean, that is how we got started with components, so that's where I want to pick up. For that, here in the source folder, I will first of all create a brand new file, and I will name it app.view. You don't have to name it app, but it is a convention to name your main file, which holds your main Vue app configuration, app.view. .view is the extension which I'll use so that I can use these single file component features in that file, having a separate template, script, and styling section. I like that a lot. It helps me split that logic and yet have it all in one place, and therefore we will work with such Vue files a lot throughout this course and in any Vue application you're going to build. So app.view it is, and now in here we can create two of these three sections you saw before. Create a template tag, opening and closing, like this, and create a script tag, opening and closing. We don't need a style tag for the moment, we'll add it later. Now I will emphasize again, this is not code that would normally work. It's also not a JavaScript file, it's a .view file. So only this Vue project setup knows how to handle it, and behind the scenes Vue will basically transform this all to just regular JavaScript code, which the browser will understand. But we're going to use this setup since for us as a developer, that will make life easier. And now in these script tags, we provide the configuration for our Vue app here. For the app, we want to mount to this div here in the index.html file. So therefore, we create a standard JavaScript object here, and we can also store this in a constant named app if we want to. And in here, we can now add what we learned about. We can add data, we can add methods, we can add computed, we can add whatever we need in this Vue app. Now for the moment, I don't need methods and computed, but here in my main app, I want to add some data, and therefore we'll return our object here as we learned it, and in there have my friends. Right? Because that is what we had in the component intro module as well. And there we had two friend elements where every element was just an object with an ID. For example, we had Manuel here with a name, which again could be Manuel Lawrence or whichever friend name you want to add, with a phone number where I just going to enter a random phone number here, and an email where I will also just enter a fictional email address. And then we can duplicate this to also have a second friend, and I used Julie before, so I'm going to repeat that name, Julie Jones, also with a random phone number here. And again, this is all really up to you. And here I have Julie at localhost. So now we got data in our app config object here, and if we leave aside how we use this object, because currently we're not using it at all except for storing it in this constant, if we leave that aside, it's just what we learned, right? We have an object with a data method where we return the data object. So that's all what we learned before as well. Now this should be the config object for our main app here. How do we now get this config object in the app.view file into our createApp method in main.js? Well, we're going to use this import syntax here, which you already see here. This is a modern JavaScript feature which we use in Vue CLI created Vue projects to combine different JavaScript files and export a feature in one file and use it in another. For that, we import something from, and then you point at the file from which you want to import. And here you should use a relative import starting with /, which means it's in the same folder as this file, and then the file name, in this case, app.view. The import here looks a bit different. It's not ./view here, because here we're importing from a package, from this view package. And if you're importing from a package, you just reference the package name. But if you're importing from a custom file, like app.view, you specify the path to that file. Now that ... is not the valid syntax though. Instead, we could import a named export by using curly braces, or a default export. Now you might not know what the difference is. Here we're going to use a default export by just coming up with any name of our choice here and importing that from that file. And this identifier here is really up to you. It could be hello, it could be something, but typically you name it just like the file was named, because in there we have our main app configuration, so I'm going to name it app here as well. And this is now what we pass to create app, because app, what we import here, should just be this JavaScript object, this view config JavaScript object. However, at the moment we're not exporting this here. To export it, we should rather not store it in a constant, which would only be available in this file and not in any other file, but instead we use a syntax which is also default modern JavaScript. Export, the export keyword, and then the default keyword. And this tells JavaScript that this object here is the default export of this app.view file. And that means that whenever we import like this, we're going to import that default. So we're going to import that object. So we're sharing this object from the app.view file to the main.js file, and therefore in the end we pass this config object to create app here. And we're splitting this in multiple files just to organize our code and to make every file focused on a certain task, and therefore the overall project more readable, which will really shine if you're building bigger, more complex projects. So now, long story short, we got our app config object here. Now you'll notice one thing. This view app, which we create here in the end, has no template. We mount it to the div with ID app, but this is an empty div. Now, if we would have something in there, like a h2 tag, we could, for example, use view features in there. That's what you learned. But in Vue CLI created projects like this is typically not what you do. You leave that index.html file alone. Instead, that is what we have this template section for in a .view file. Here, we can now define the template of this Vue app. So here, we could now add a h2 tag and say my friends, and then below that, for example, add an unordered list where we want to output all those friends here, like this. And we could also wrap this all into a section if we wanted to. So we can write our HTML code for this script here. And this is just regular HTML markup. Now if we save that all, and we go back to the page, localhost 8080, with the development server up and running, this page automatically updated without you reloading it to show our app content. So to show this parsed and rendered template which we defined for our main app. And that's how we work with those .view files and with a project setup like this. Now this has nothing to do with components thus far, that's just a different way of creating our Vue app, but it's important to understand this because we will create components basically in the same way. So let's do that as a next step. Let's add our first component in this setup before we then really dive into component communication.